Welcome everyone to this very special edition of Het Denkgelag. Apologies for the delay. We won't keep you waiting for longer. I'm very honored to be your host and your moderator tonight. For those of you who don't know us, we started out last year with a couple of episodes, very informal discussions actually about science, philosophy, critical thinking, etc. Maybe on a slightly smaller scale than today. But we decided to move up to the next level. We're a little more ambitious. And we even decided to call this episode a Royale edition. And if you have a look at our distinguished panel here tonight, I think you will understand why we chose this slightly pompous title. We thought that with this concentration of brain power, we might as well tackle some of the big issues, you know. So this could equally have been called an episode about life, the universe, and everything.
Oh, I know the answer to that one.
Right. Well, just
I only know
try to keep it like try not to reveal the secrets until we have calculated it. So before we go down into that rabbit hole, let me very briefly introduce our guests. Maybe they hardly need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. On the far side, the gentleman there who seems to know the answer to life, the universe, and everything is Professor Dr. Massimo Pigliucci. He is the head of the philosophy department at the City University of New York. He is a biologist turned philosopher, and depending on your perspective, he has either seen the light or strayed into darkness. He's a very prolific writer, as all three of our guests are. He wrote numerous books on evolution and intelligent design, various sorts of pseudoscience, on skepticism, the meaning of life, etc. His latest book is called Answers for Aristotle, in which he explores how an alliance of science and philosophy, not just science, but science and philosophy, can make our lives more meaningful. In the middle is Professor Daniel Dennett. He is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist at Tufts University near Boston. He is famous for being one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, together with his new atheist colleagues, the biologist Richard Dawkins, the philosopher Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens. He is arguably the most friendly, most amiable of the four atheists. I think I can say so. I hope you agree. Right. The softest.
I can tell you.
He's sorry. Dare I say cuddly? No.
Yeah. He's very cuddly.
He wrote also numerous books on evolution, philosophy of mind, consciousness, free will. He has an oeuvre that spans more than 4 decades. His most important work is maybe... Well, what is your most important work, Professor Dennett?
You were about to walk into a trap.
Consciousness explained. Yeah.
Sorry?
Probably consciousness explained.
Right, consciousness explained. I think that's a very good choice. As you wrote it, of course, who am I?
If you say so.
Anyhow, his latest book provides an overview of his work and is titled Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. It is translated into Dutch, if I'm not mistaken, as de gereedschapskist van ons denken. Next to me is Professor Lawrence Krauss. He's a theoretical physicist and cosmologist. He is the director of the Origins project at Arizona State University. He has also written numerous books, among them The Physics of Star Trek, Quintessence, and his latest book, A Universe from Nothing. How or why? There is something rather than nothing. He is also one of the 2 stars in a film documentary called The Unbelievers, which follows Professor Krauss and his atheist colleague, Richard Dawkins, whom you may remember as one of the 4 horsemen, around the world, spreading, can I use the word gospel here, the message of science and reason. Apologies for that. not gospel. So just to kick things off, I'm going to tell a little story from Greek mythology. According to the Greeks, there was a message written above the pillars of Gibraltar. It was written by the hero Hercules, and it served as a warning. You can see it actually, or you should be able to see it. It served as a warning to sailors and navigators not to venture beyond that point, which marked the edge of at least the known world at that point. In Latin, the phrase is nec plus ultra, or non plus ultra, and it translates roughly as no further beyond. This is the end of the world.
Those Greeks really knew their Latin.
Yeah, right. I was looking for the Greek phrase, actually. I don't know why. I mean, blame it on Wikipedia, right, on my... I haven't written these notes myself. So. I have another cue. Later on, the opposite of the phrase, plus ultra, again, quite impressive for those Greeks, was adopted centuries later as the national motto of Spain. And it was actually, as you can tell, it was an invitation in defiance of the ancient wisdom to go further, to explore new territories, which was, of course, after the discovery of the new world. To boldly go where no man has gone before. Yeah. Right, and you don't have to be afraid about monsters and sea dragons, or you don't have to be afraid to be swallowed up into the pits of hell. Just go as far as you can and see where you end up. Charles V, by the way, was actually born here in Ghent, and this brings us right back to the debates. You probably know what I'm getting at, where this is going. So I'm going to put this open question to all of you. Do you think that there is a nec plus ultra in science? Do you think that science has limits? Do you think it is dangerous for science to venture beyond the point where it is not allowed to go? I don't know who is willing to go first.
Well, let's the scientists go first, right?
Right.
I was going to say you go first. But
all right, fine.
We'll go this way, because you got to introduce first.
Sure. I hate the phrase limits of science because it's so often misinterpreted as, as if it were really a signpost that says, sorry, you're allowed to get here, but not beyond. But it depends on what you mean by the phrase, right? I mean, clearly there are limits to science because science is a human activity and human beings have limited, epistemic capabilities. We can understand certain things, and I'm sure there are certain things that we're not going to be able to understand. Even if we were smart enough, there are certainly things that we don't have or we're not going to have enough information to figure out. So in that sense, certainly there are limits to science. So that's one sense in which it's true. But it's no comfort to theologians or mystics or woo-woo thinkers of any sort. It's on a signpost. The other sense in which I think there may be a limit to science, and maybe that may be a little more controversial tonight, is that I think that science is a particular type of epistemic activity. It's a particular way of getting to know things. In particular, it's the best way we figure out to know about how the world works. But as such, as a human activity, it does have certain domain of applications where it does very well, and it has domains of applications where it does a little less well, and it has domains of applications where it, frankly, doesn't really matter that much.
Now it gets interesting.
Right.
So that is the limit of science, in the sense of it is...
In that sense, right. In the sense that it's, science is a set of tools, and right. Since not all problems are amenable to the same kind of tools, right. Then there are certain things you really don't want to use a hammer because they're not nails.
Right. Professor Krauss, do you agree?
Well, in many ways I agree. In fact, it's sort of unfortunate it's called a debate. I think people will be upset because there won't be so much disagreement. I was saying to Dan in the car that we're all reasonable people. We're all reasonable people on this stage, and how could any reasonable person disagree with me and Dan? But anyway,
never happened before.
but certainly there are limits to science. As an empiricist, which is what I am, empirically there are limits to what science can do. In fact, in my own field, cosmology, there are clearly limits because we have one universe to observe, and most of us live in that universe. The Republican Party in my country doesn't, so therefore, because of that, there may be many universes, and therefore there's obviously, in some real physical sense, a limited domain over which we can explore, and that's the key point. It's not just tools. Every academic discipline uses tools, and in some ways they're not that different. But the key part of what makes science and what makes it work is it's based on empirical evidence. Sort of rational thought applied to empirical evidence. And therefore, if you can't measure it, even in principle, I mean, there's lots of things we can't measure that we can talk about as a theoretical physicist. I think about things, a lot of things we can't measure right now. But if you can't ever measure it in principle, then science really has nothing to say about it. I would argue that anything else you tend to say about it is not worth much either. But it's certainly a fact that science generally can't address it if you can't measure it in principle. And that's of fundamental importance, I think, and we forget that. And so I think the difference that I would say is that the limits, I don't know what the ultimate limits to science are. There are limits now, and there are many areas where science has very little to say right now. But can I say that it will never have anything to say about it? Absolutely not. There's a huge difference between what's unknowable and what's not known. And so the only way you can find out if science has anything to say about it is try.
Right.
And if it has something useful to say that make predictions which agree with experiments, then you can make progress. But you can try it, and it might not work. And an example, might be sort of sociology, where they tried to use the language of physics to apply to societies, and it was far too premature. They're much too complex. And consciousness, which is, as I was telling Dan, if I did physics because it's easy. If I want to do the hard stuff, I do consciousness.
Right. Am I right that you say that even if there are limits to science, and we may never know, then that doesn't provide any comfort to people advocating other ways of knowing? If science has limits, then maybe that's a general limit.
Let me say something that Massimo may jump on, just for the purpose of entertainment. I don't think there are other ways of knowing. If you talk about what knowing is, other ways of knowing are an illusion, in my opinion.
Right.
That ultimately, when you think about what you know, it doesn't come by revelation. It ultimately comes from some empirical basis. And of course, you can reflect on it and think about it and learn things based on that reflection, but it ultimately comes down to what you can measure. And therefore, I don't think there are other ways of knowing.
Right.
And
Maybe they're an empiricist.
Professor Dennett, is it right that every knowledge is derived from empirical evidence, that this is the sole source of knowledge? Or
I would say no, because I think there's a lot of mathematical knowledge, and I don't think that mathematical knowledge is based on empirical facts. Formal systems, mathematical knowledge is inspired by empirical issues. After all, just think of what geometry means. It means measuring the Earth. And but once you've got geometry, then you have non-Euclidean geometries and other sorts of geometries.
But don't you think a proof is an empirical piece of work? I mean, it is. It is. I mean, you can ask, is it consistent with what you know already?
There's an important empirical side, which is, I think, often underestimated. And this came out like a ton of bricks for me when I saw a wonderful documentary that was done on Andrew Wiles' proof of Fermat's last theorem. And here were these number theorists trying to explain it to the general public and to people like me who was no number theorist. And what hit me was, first of all, not only would I not know whether Wiles had proved Fermat's last theorem, Wiles wouldn't know whether he'd proved Fermat's last theorem until, and this is basically a sociological or a social fact, until his peers, his fellow experts in mathematics, reluctantly and contra their own interests, they would love to win the glory, say, he's got it. Right. And it's only when the consensus among mathematicians is he did it. That's the first time anybody has any confidence that the proof is actually sound.
Sure, but that's true. But I think that we should be careful here I'm going to follow up on Dan's comment on mathematics, which is one example. Logic, of course, is another one. They're closely related for obvious reasons. But I mean, we need to be careful about how we use the words like science or empirical evidence and so on and so forth, because yes, if you expand empirical evidence to, say, including the cross-checking of proofs, then pretty much everything that deals with language becomes empirical.
Yeah.
Even theology would become empirical.
But yeah, exactly. But I think that is, in some sense, cheating, because when people think of science, even when most scientists think of science, that's not what they're thinking about. What you're thinking about when you talk about science, we're talking about the way in which normally physics, biology, chemistry, geology, and so on work. So systematic observations, controlled experiments, that sort of stuff. Now, if you limit science to that kind of view, then it seems to me clear that mathematics has very little to do in terms, or logic has very little to do with it. It certainly has implications for science. It certainly gets its inspirations occasionally from science, but a lot of mathematics and logic work is independent.
I mean, it's semantics. I think I agree with you that it's a semantic difference. For me, science is obviously much more expansive, because ultimately mathematics is a language. It isn't knowledge, by the way. It's a language, and it doesn't. It's not the world. It's a model of the world, and it doesn't describe the world exactly. It's a model of the world. It's the best model we have, but there's no mathematics that exactly describes the world at all levels. So even people think that somehow mathematics is an ultimate description of reality. It isn't. There's no mathematical formula that describes the universe at all scales. But nevertheless, when Weil or his colleagues are trying to determine if it's true, what they're ultimately doing is seeing if it's consistent with things they know to be true, and ultimately those things come from a set of axioms which are in some sense empirical. And so I tend to think of it, my view of science is really empiricism, and my view of empiricism is very broad. And so, we can disagree about whether my definition is your definition, but I think when we deconstruct that, we'd probably agree.
Right. So it's partly a semantic issue, but maybe before we go any further, I had the idea of checking with the audience, because now they haven't given a sense of your initial position and also some semantic clarification. So I think it's time to ask the audience, if we phrase it like this: do you think that science is the sole source of knowing? And there may be all sorts of confusion. If there are philosophers in the room, sorry, you have to ignore semantics for a while. So in Dutch, wie denkt u dat wetenschap de enige bron van kennis is? Let's just raise hands and see what is. What people that don't be shy. Just even if you don't really know what the question is about, you can be confident that you can have an answer. Nobody's going to check if you really thought it true.
Raise the house lights. Then that's empiricism.
Yeah, it's a lot of people who are all in favor of science. So, and who thinks that besides science, there are other ways of knowing? Dus wie denkt dat er naast wetenschap ook nog andere kenvormen zijn? Dus wetenschap is niet het alpha en omega. I think that a majority of people, if I'm correct, is in favor of the view that science rules supreme. So do we have some work to do?
That's too bad. So let's get to work.
Let's get to work. I think we want, just to get it a little more specific, let's jump to one of our topics.
I think, however, that, I'm sorry, Dan was about to comment on the last thing that Lawrence said about the expansive definition of science.
Right, if you have a short comment to make before we move to
I think that your definition as empiricism, it raises some semantic problems.
Yeah, semantic problems.
So, for instance, I think you know that there is no largest prime. I think you know that 2 + 2 is 4. I think you know that the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle add up to 2 right angles.
But those are based on empirical. No, but I do on the basis of empirical evidence of what I know. There's no largest prime because the proof of largest primes relies on things I can see, work with, and manipulate.
Right. But then you see, you are using the very point I was making about using basically social facts about what mathematicians agree on and so forth.
I don't care who told me the
fact.
I mean,
you do.
The numbers are there. It doesn't matter whether they were white males or not.
No, if there was a coven of mathematicians in Utah.
There probably is.
There probably is.
Yeah.
And they claim to have proved the ABC conjecture. You'd probably think, not likely.
No, I tend to think it's not likely whenever I read anything anyone says.
Yes.
My first response is, convince me.
Right.
I bet it's your first response, I hope.
Speaking of things that are not likely,
Yeah.
Let's talk about God.
Do we have to? Can
Well,
we talk about
well,
knowledge or reality or
Just
something?
to get it
Okay.
over with. I know it's we can as soon as we have dealt with God, we can move on to less frivolous
Okay,
matters,
it should take a minute.
more weighty subjects. But let's just try to.
I'm sorry,
handle it for a
you're
couple
asking
of
3
minutes.
atheists here,
Right,
You
I know.
understand that?
So,
Okay.
Well, last time we checked, as you say, none of you have any religious faith.
This was before a dinner.
I think, right.
I don't have faith in
The
anything.
question is, do you think that science, no matter how you define it, or maybe it depends, has disproven or refuted God's existence?
Well,
do you
the whole-
think
you
that
can-
God is a scientific
You
hypothesis?
can't disprove an unprovable hypothesis.
Right. That's an interesting
you
answer.
can, but you can render it so preposterously unlikely that anybody who still takes it seriously has a serious problem.
Yeah, that's
And,
what
and I think that's really important. And science has definitely done that but there are different levels. And people are in this audience, some of them may be spiritual. They say, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I never know what that means. But there are people who would say, well, I think there's some purpose to the universe. I don't believe in the world's religion. There's some purpose. And I think it is an overstatement to say that there is none. What we can say is there's absolutely no evidence of purpose to the universe. But what we can say, and what I think is really important, is that science is inconsistent with every religion in the world. That every organized religion based on scripture and doctrine, that is inconsistent with science. So they're all garbage and nonsense.
Right.
That you can say with definitive authority. I don't like to use the word authority. But the idea of purpose, vague purpose, all I can say is there's no evidence for it, and every bit of evidence suggests that it isn't there. But how can you go beyond that?
I'm going to go even a little further, if possible. I mean, they've done a perfectly good job at demolishing the whole thing. But you can go even further. So I get nervous whenever I hear people talking about the God hypothesis, because I think that's conceding too much.
Right.
The
It's a
idea of God.
concept that Richard Dawkins uses your
Yeah.
fellow
And so
atheist.
it seems to me that in order to talk about a hypothesis, you really have to have something, fairly well articulated, coherent, that makes predictions that are actually falsified, all that sort of stuff. And concepts of God, first of all, are heterogeneous, because let's not forget that it's not like all people on Earth believe in a particular kind of God. There's all sorts of stuff out there. But all these concepts are incoherent. They're badly, put together, if put together at all. So to say that science sort of defeats the God hypothesis is actually even to give too much to the concept of God. There's nothing to defeat there. It's an incoherent, badly articulated concept. So why do you use a sledgehammer to?
You wrote
It's
that
an
it's not
intellectual
even
compound.
wrong.
Yeah.
When you refuse to think, you call it God.
Right.
Yeah.
But that does bring me back, if you don't mind, to the issue of semantics, because of course it depends on what you mean by God. It's part of the answer, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But let me put it another way. Can you think of any empirical, scientific, solid evidence that would convince you of the existence of some supernatural creator that you would call God? I mean, if he would just burst through the roof here and point at the three of you and say, "Stop spreading his
No,
nonsense
that
about
I would
atheists,"
think
etc.
it's the beer or the whiskey talking.
Right.
Now, that wouldn't do it. But no, there's plenty of things you could do. I mean, we go out at night and all of a sudden the stars are rearranged and say, "You suckers, you better
In
believe."
Aramaic, only in Aramaic would I believe.
Yes, something like, and everybody can see them, not just me, because then I go back to the whiskey hypothesis. But actually, there is more interesting ways of doing it. I just read recently a sci-fi novel, which I tend to think of good science fiction as thought experiments, in essentially like thought experiments in philosophy. And this one is called Calculating God, and it's about an alien that comes down to Earth and asks to see a paleontologist. And the guy looks like an arachnid, so he's kind of an invertebrate thing. And the museum guard doesn't get that it's an actual alien. He thinks it's a joke, so he plays along and says, "Well, would you like a vertebrate or an invertebrate paleontologist?" And the alien, it's puzzled. It says, "Well, I thought that the only paleontologists on Earth were humans, so it must be a vertebrate."
Right.
But so he gets to talk to the paleontologist. Turns out that the alien has very, very solid, very, very good empirical evidence across a bunch of different races that there in fact is such a thing as an intelligent designer of the cosmos.
Right.
And so the rest of the novel explores how the scientist reacts to that thing. That situation is unlikely, but it's possible.
It's possible. So,
Well,
because if there was nothing that would possibly convince you, then maybe that's that's worrisome, because there's something about. I mean, if there's nothing that can convince you, then it almost sounds as if
Faith.
as if it's some sort of faith.
Yeah, but I mean, but the thing that would, as a philosopher, that would bother you about that, I think, would be
I'm curious.
the fundamental problem with that picture is that intelligent design implies there's an intelligent designer,
Sure.
but then of course that implies the intelligent designer is more complex than the thing the intelligent designer is designing, and then the question of always, it becomes an infinite regression.
Sure.
Who designed the intelligent designer? And that's the real logical problem.
Although, to be honest, I always found that, I mean, that is a perfectly reasonable question to ask, but I always found that question a little bit disingenuous when it's asked by atheists. Because, yes, of course, that would be an obvious question, but so what? I mean, if we really had convincing evidence of intelligent design, then sure, the designer...
We could have convincing evidence that, except we
But it
don't have that
wouldn't be
evidence.
evidence for God.
Yeah,
it would be evidence for really smart people in another galaxy that designed our stuff.
It could be
Right.
Francis Crick's panspermia, but
Yeah,
an organized
exactly.
panspermia.
Correct.
Where you decide you want to, like that awful movie Prometheus,
Yes.
where you want to seed the earth with...
or the big programmer in the sky. I mean, we're all part of a big simulation, and somebody else has studied the game.
I know Ridley
Professor
Scott, so I
Dennett,
should say sorry.
do you think that you can only think of evidence for like a hyper-intelligent alien race, and not so much for a god, for a deity? Because maybe you would also have always have this thought in the back of your mind. Oh, wait a minute, there's this thing about infinite regress. So
What do you mean by God? You mean someone who can suspend the laws of nature?
Well, somebody outside the universe. Like supernatural.
The trouble is that if, sort of by definition, God is not just an intelligent designer but supernatural, then I don't think we can ever have well, no, I'm going to back off on that and say, no, I can conjure up bizarre fantasies, which, if that happened, would impress me tremendously.
Yeah.
I'll make one up on the spot, okay? Somebody shows up, I don't care what he looks like, and he says, if you drill down 2 miles deep into the mantle, such and such a place on Earth, at just exactly this location, you will find down there, a golden plate. I'm going to borrow from Joseph Smith. You'll find a golden plate, and on it is written the genome of Craig Venter.
Okay.
All right, and first of all, we cannot imagine a natural way that gold plate could get down 2 miles under the earth, and sure enough, we do it, and it comes up. Something like that would shiver my timbers.
But but you hit on a key point, and I think it's really important, and this is the reason that knowledge is empirical, is that you cannot imagine it. And we have to be very careful as scientists to say, when we say we cannot imagine something being, because then if we observe it, we have to try and understand if there is any imaginable way to before we attribute it to the most exotic possibility, we have to see if there's any far less exotic possibility that could explain it, and we are obligated to do that. And it's true not just for something as crazy as that. When we see a peak at the Large Hadron Collider, we're obligated to examine every more mundane possibility before we say we've discovered a new elementary particle.
Right.
And if we don't, and that's the fact that you want to disprove the very hypothesis that you're hoping for, is what makes science different than religion. One of the many things.
I don't want to agree too much, but I'm going to bring in another sci-fi scenario in favor of what
Very short, so that we have to...
Sure, whatever.
A whole sci-fi novel, okay.
So I'm a Star Trek fan, and one of the episodes of Star Trek I read your book, actually. So one of the episodes of The Next Generation that is most pertinent to this discussion is called The Devil's Due. And it's a situation where the Enterprise happened to be orbiting a planet where people are scared out of their wits because the devil has come back to claim her due. It's a female, of course, it's a woman. And And of course, Captain Picard doesn't buy for a second that this woman really is the devil, although she apparently can do miraculous things. She can conjure earthquakes on a whim. She can appear and disappear from one side or the other of the planet, so on and so forth. Of course, by the end of the episode, it turns out that sure enough, she's just a trickster. She's using a series of highly technologically sophisticated tricks, but that's what it is, right? And that is the problem, that even though it's conceivable that there can be an intelligent designer that is in fact truly supernatural, meaning that he or she can actually act outside or suspending the laws of nature, it's much harder to imagine what set of circumstances would truly convince us of that, because you always have the suspicion that, you know what, I just don't know enough about this stuff. It could be that it's the Enterprise out there doing
It's
this.
very difficult to rule out alternative natural
But now that takes us back to the subject, or if it is the subject, the limits of science.
Right.
Because one of the biggest misunderstandings of science is that scientific revolutions do away with everything that went before them. That's not how science works. Because what has satisfied the test of experiment will always work. Newton's laws have been supplanted by general relativity, but if you want to throw a baseball, 400 years, a million years from now, if my favorite baseball team wins the World Series, which may be the next time it happens, that ball will be described by Newton's laws because it survived the test of experiment. We'll learn things that will change our fundamental understanding, the base of that, but they'll never contradict Newton's laws. So it is true that at the limits of our knowledge, anything may be possible, and we can't presume when we see something strange to say it's supernatural, natural. But if it violates things that have been tested over and over again, something that's fundamental to Newton's laws or the basis of science, then it would be much more implausible that it's new physics. I mean, if you let a ball go and it fell up instead of down, that would be
truly
much more. So it's not the edges, it's not the exotic stuff. It's the really basic stuff that you can be pretty confident about.
Right. Let's move on to a different topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Finally. Another possible limit of science is the idea that science can teach us about the empirical facts, as all of you agree, but not about what we ought to do, not about how we should behave, not about ethics. So, Professor Krauss, let me start with you. Do you think that science, single-handedly, without the help of other ways of knowing, can tell us how we should behave?
Yeah, I do, but I'm going to use my expansive definition of science.
Of course.
I mean, the point is that we can't even ask the question how we should behave until we know what the consequences of our actions are, very first. The only way to know the consequences of our actions is science, namely empirical observation, so you can see the consequences. If you hit someone with an axe, are they going to in the head? Are they going to die? And that's so before you can make any judgment, you have to know the consequences of your actions. So that's the first step. I'd almost turn around. Without science, you can't possibly have an ethics or morals. Although morals is a word that I'm much less enthusiastic about.
So that would be the weaker claim.
But so that's the first level.
Right.
But I would argue that after that,
That's already going too far. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay. But after that, what we do is we ultimately make rational decisions. I mean, we are, of course, I'm not going to argue that we know that we're governed by emotional responses and all the rest. Although ultimately, I think science will help us understand those emotional responses. Neuroscience will, it doesn't yet. And so I think ultimately, most of the people who make ethical decisions based on a set of premises which are generally rational. And so I think rational thought applied to empirical evidence is what I call science. And so in that sense, I don't see, certainly you don't get your ethics from a book of revelations. You get it either from some genetic predisposition, if there are evolutionary bases of certain responses, but science will help us understand those, or from some rational decision making. So ultimately, I think the whole question of ethics comes down to scientific questions. Yeah.
Right. Professor Pigliucci.
I think that answer confuses several different things, which need to be taken, separately. So first of all, we're back to just semantics. I mean, you know, and you can, you know, I really rather not dismiss the discussion as just, I hate it when people say just semantics. Semantics is very important because semantics is about language and meaning. If we don't agree on the meaning, then we're not having even a discussion, right? Okay, so the thing is, clearly you can come up with an expansive enough definition of science. If you say, you know, science has to do with anything that has even remotely you know, input from the empirical world. And I define input from the empirical world, even the kind of things we were talking about earlier in terms of mathematics and logic. Then, of course, everything is science. You sort of win by definition, but that seems like an empty, you know, Pyrrhic victory. It's like, okay, now what are you saying then? Most people don't think that that is what science is. In fact, most scientists don't think that that's what science is.
Well, I don't
so
know
we
how
need to
you
make
can say
distinctions.
that, okay.
And also, the problem is with that sort of expansive definition is that you can play that game, right? I mean, I can say, well, you know, philosophy is about thinking, and since everything we do implies thinking, that we're always philosophizing. Well,
we may
yeah,
always
it's
think,
some, well, but that becomes an empty. I think, at least, I wouldn't go that far because that becomes sort of an empty statement. It's like, so what? I'd like to hear Dan,
right,
and then I have a couple more things about consequences to say.
Yes. Are we doing philosophy now, or are we doing science, according to some expansive definition?
Ignoring an issue which I think actually gets to the heart of your question, and that is, should we count all of the normative wisdom that we have acquired over the years as science? Again, a semantic issue. But there's a lot of it. There's how to play good chess. There's whether bridge is a better game than whist. There's, just to take some relatively trivial examples.
So those are normative.
They are normative. Right. Now, a lot of people would say normative systems of thought are not science. I think you would say, oh, yes, they are.
Well, how can you know if bridge is better than whist if you haven't played either or you don't know the rules?
Well, yeah, but that's...
I mean,
but
so
that's,
you can't just close your mind and have a revelation.
No, of course not.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
But still, what I'm getting at is that the propositions include propositions which say, this is better than that, or this is the right way of doing this. And those are normative. Now, normativity plays a role everywhere in science, but it does have a rather marked role. And I think that if you think of, say, ethical issues and political issues as, in the end, fundamentally normative, which is what philosophers have typically said, this is, you know, what counts as a good life? How ought we to live? If you think of questions of that sort as cousins to, in fact, very close cousins to, questions like, which is a better game, canasta or bridge? Now, how could you ever answer that question? It's obviously going to be relative to what kind of players are playing the game.
But
human beings are such... I'm going to take an example, okay? Chess was improved several times over the years. The castling rule was introduced, the moving the pawn to the en passant rule. Those were considered improvements, and I think almost everybody agrees. That's improvements by our lights. We're impatient human beings, and we just think the game is better. Play it a little faster. That's all it is. But these are normative judgments. They have an empirical base, of course. You have to play the games. You have to. You'd never dream of making an evaluation without doing the empirical work. But once you've made the evaluation, it has a different logical standing. It's different from just saying people in North America like this kind of chess.
Absolutely, but on the other hand, it's not only subjective, but it's time variant. So absolutely, it depends on, you know, the word better is, you know, whether this is better than that depends on who you are, where you are, when you are. And so those are all, so it doesn't have any independent reality. What's good doesn't have an independent reality, and therefore arguing about whether science determines it seems to me is just an irrelevant question.
That's a red herring.
Well, I mean, what's good?
Well, to call it an independent reality is, I think, that's a straw man.
But you would agree. But you would agree that it's that it is. Well, the question I would ask is, do you agree that it is that those kind of questions are not the answer to those kind of questions may not be universal.
Yeah.
Okay. And therefore, they are, to understand them, you have to often understand not only the individual background, but the cultural experiences, et cetera, et cetera.
And if we had a large group of people meeting together in a organized political debate discussion where they were going to vote and try to settle on some rules for how to lead a good life. That could be done rationally.
Yeah.
It could be done well. And if it succeeded, we could all remark that this was one of the great achievements of human intelligence.
Well, how do you determine
but
success?
The question is, would it be science? And I think, no, it would be political action.
Right.
But how do you know?
And it wouldn't be
how do you know if
science.
it succeeds? That's the question. To determine if it succeeds is a scientific question. Is it? Once again, you know if it succeeds by studying what happens based on those laws, seeing, and then asking people if they're happy or if they whatever your criteria are. And so, in some sense, to know if it succeeds is a scientific question.
But there is a lot there in that swept into the whatever those criteria are. Yeah. There is a lot of stuff going on that is not actually empirical.
Of course.
Look, here's another way to put the problem. First of all, when you started talking about consequences, it's kind of interesting because to a philosopher that immediately brings up, so he has chosen a consequentialist frame of mind.
Yeah, I've heard this consequentialism and all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's not the only. All that stuff is philosophy. Consequentialism is one way of looking at ethical problems. It's by no means the universally agreed upon way.
But it's probably a component of every way, right?
No.
I mean, you may not make your ultimate decision on what is the appropriate action. You might not be a consequentialist,
right?
But you probably have to at least address the issue of consequences when you are using other criteria to decide what's. Of course, we are.
For example, in the game of chess, you could say that there are objective, normative rules because you have a pre-established goal. You want to force the other one to checkmate. Yeah. It's only when you agree on that goal that you can have an objective measure of success and you can see which moves are better than other ones. Yeah. But the more fundamental question is, of course, if we change the goal, I mean, and in chess they are opposite goals, of course, because we have a challenge, but in morality, don't we have to find some way to agree on the goal first? I mean,
yes. But the question is that
science?
A scientific question. Imagine that there was a great debate raging over how to play chess. Should you keep the en passant rule? Should you keep castling or not? And it turned out that there were heated debates. There were people who liked the old way, people who liked the new way, and we think, well, now what are we going to do? Well, what we could do, hoping that it would work, is have a conclave, get all the parties in who are interested, who cared, and see if one side could convince the other that their way was better. If they can't, that's an empirical discovery. It doesn't work. But if they do, if everybody that cares comes to see and agree quite wholeheartedly, look, this is the right way to play chess. Right. That's not just an empirical fact. It is an empirical fact, and you got to test it by, you got to count the votes and all the rest of that. But it also has a rather different standard.
And I think that what another way to put what I think Dan is getting at is that nobody in his right mind, I think, no philosopher in his right mind, is saying that empirical facts, or in fact even some scientific facts, as it should be clear by now, I take a more restricted definition of science or concept of science than Lawrence does. But even if we want to talk about empirical facts, broadly speaking, nobody's denying, or at least nobody should be denying, and certainly not in this group, that empirical facts are relevant to ethical decisions. Okay, that's not the question. The question is, another way to put what Dan was saying a minute ago is that the empirical facts, most of the time, if not all the times, in ethical decision making, are going to underdetermine those decisions, those value judgments that we make. So the way I think of ethics is essentially applied rationality. You start first of all with certain general ideas. Are you adopting a utilitarian framework? Are you adopting a deontological framework? Are you adopting a virtue ethics framework, or whatever it is? And then that essentially plays the equivalent role of sort of general axioms, if you will, in mathematics, or general assumptions in logic. And then from there, you incorporate knowledge empirical knowledge about, among other things, what kind of beings humans are. Right? Because ethics is, let's not forget it, it's about human beings. If it were not social animals, intelligent, conscious animals of a particular type, the whole point of ethics wouldn't hold, right?
But there's also the issue of, sorry.
Well, obviously, what you both said is reasonable in that sense, but it suggests in some sense that ethics has some existence. It's like, if someone's pretty. What? Okay, does pretty have an objective? Now, I would not say that science determines pretty. Science can determine why I may think on the basis of my cultural experience or my gender, what's pretty. Right. And it can determine why someone else would determine that something very different is pretty. But it wouldn't suggest that that pretty has any meaning beyond that. And so I guess what I worry about is when it is absolutely true that when humans make ethical decisions, I don't live my life every day, saying, well, what's the rational? I act as a human because humans aren't fully rational. Right. Okay, I'm governed by emotion and all of that. But to assign some reality to something which is just a construct that varies and depends upon circumstances is, I think, overdoing it. And I think ethics is that.
I don't think we were doing that, and I don't think most ethicists would agree with that. What do you think?
I think you're conjuring up a ghost that isn't really there.
Maybe.
But let me
Wait,
get back.
Is there
let
a
me
ghost
get back
that is there?
to the question that was asked earlier, and that was other ways of knowing. I would say no, there aren't other ways of knowing, but there's other ways of doing things.
Absolutely.
And
I would
some
agree
of
with
them
that
are
100%.
really good, and some of them are really important. They're just not ways of knowing.
Right.
We agree completely. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Oh, well, then can we
Great,
go for a
then
beer?
we can...
Okay.
We have 26 more topics to go. Is it okay?
Sure.
That's well put.
Well, there's also maybe the question I wanted to ask earlier was you brought up the example of you need science to know what the consequence is of just
anything.
Well, just hitting someone on the head with an axe. Well, and there is sometimes this temptation to look at brain scanners, for example, and to say, see, this person is suffering, so this is objectively wrong. But then, I'm always wondering, do we really need sophisticated scientific equipment to know that? It's just we can tell. We didn't need science to know that somebody was suffering.
The answer depends on the question you're asking.
Does it give us more confidence if we have a brain scanner? Because it seems like that
well,
now
if you
it's
understand
a scientific basis.
and Dan is probably the biggest expert in this group here, but if you understand what the signals mean, and I think the big problem with neuroscience is at this point is that there are lots of signals, and some people think they have some deep understanding what they mean, but they probably don't.
No, but I think that's worse than that. I think that what Maarten is getting at is different. There are some instances where actual science, what I would consider, even in my restricted definition of science actually is pertinent. Let's say, for instance, that we're having a debate about abortion. And let's say that because of a number of pieces of reasoning, we started with certain assumption, blah, 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 we arrive at the conclusion that, okay, abortion is reasonable up until the moment in which the fetus begins to feel pain. Let's assume for the sake of argument that that's what, I know. Yeah, let's assume that that's what we're getting, right? Well, if we get there, now at that point really is the job of the developmental and neurobiologists to tell us, well, what's your best estimate of when that happens, right? So that's a clear example where neurobiology or developmental biology
but
really
does... But once you realize that their best estimate is probably garbage, at least at this point.
Maybe.
Not garbage, it's a better estimate than other people's, but it's uncertain.
But the point is, that is a clear case to me where science either does already or could very, very likely in the future, do that sort of stuff. But I think what Maarten was getting at is, for instance, I can bring up my regular whipping boy, one of the other three horsemen.
You mean I'm not? Okay, no, sorry, go on.
Never when you're, we're friends. Okay. So, especially for drinking. Now, Sam Harris, who you introduced as a philosopher, actually would characterize mostly as a neuroscience-based sort of person. And I think that he would do it that way. When I read his book, The Moral Landscape, and which promised a scientific way of handling ethical questions, I got through the entire book and I didn't learn anything at all, zero, new about ethics.
The main thesis of the book, just for people who don't know, is that you can have a scientific basis for moral facts. Right. In the universe.
And I think that what Maarten was getting at is one of Sam's examples is exactly the fact that, if you are in the process of genetically mutilating, mutilating the genitals of a young girl, and you do a neuroscan, you'll see that that girl is really going through a lot of pain. You think? I mean, do I really need that? I mean, seriously? What does that add to the whole picture? Really? The screaming, I think, will do it for me. Thank you very much. It's like, now, screaming is empirical evidence, but I wouldn't call it scientific.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, to pay deference to my philosopher friends, when it comes to ethics, I mean, I'm not saying ethics is irrelevant. I'm just saying I think it's contextual. But there's no doubt that people who think seriously about the implications of actions are ethicists, are philosophers, and there's no doubt that one can learn from. One doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. One can learn from the detailed, complex, logical, rational thinking that philosophers do in determining what ethics may be reasonable or not. And so I think that's an essential part.
Great, we agree again. So we can move on to the next topic.
This is getting too easy.
How can something arise out of nothing?
Oh boy.
There is something, and before that, well,
I don't understand why people are bothered by that at all. I mean, I really don't. It happens every day, and people don't bother, look, the lights that are shining, so the photons that are hitting my eyes, they were emitted by electrons that are jumping between states in the atom. Where was the photon before the electron emitted it? Didn't exist.
Right.
Yeah, and suddenly, but it's enough for me to see.
But there was a lot of other stuff around.
Well,
that
I don't
maybe
care.
have
That photon
provoked
didn't
the
exist.
photon.
So the key question, and I'm glad you asked how, because that's that's the way I like to ask the question, because that's all we can.
He's careful.
Why
He's
is
a
that?
philosopher.
Yeah, but
Now I can say, why do you want
I mean, what science all the time shows how things can. In fact, the reason I wrote the book is it seems like a miracle that to get stuff, you can get stuff from no stuff. And in fact, it's easy. It happens. It's required. Quantum mechanics requires it. Now, in our universe, but it also could suggest that space and time themselves can result from no universe. Now, you can ask the deeper question, was there anything else? And those are questions you can ask. But the miracle that people seem to think is a miracle is how you get a universe when there was no universe. And that is easy to imagine without violating the known laws of physics. Now you can ask, okay, there was no universe, was there anything else? That's a different question. It's like saying, I don't care where the photon came from, I want to know where the atom was. But the simple question is, how did our universe come from nothing? That is remarkably, and in principle, answerable. And moreover, the reason I wrote the book is that if you ask what would be the characteristics of a universe that arose from no universe by laws of physics without any supernatural shenanigans, it would have precisely the characteristics of the universe we see, and it didn't have to be that way. It could have been something else. We could falsify that presumption.
Let me try a parallel that I think Lawrence may like it. We'll see.
Okay. If it agrees with me, I'll love it.
Well, we'll see.
Okay.
It's an empirical question.
There are questions that philosophers have been asking for millennia, and every now and then, a scientist comes along and says, well, instead of answering exactly that question, let me suggest a substitute question which we can answer, and which, once we've answered it, we'll sort of lose interest in the other question.
Right.
But let me choose an example where this was, I think, brilliant and comically failed to achieve its end. And that was Turing in his classic paper. He said, well, everybody wants to know if computers can think, if robots can think. He says, let me ask an easier question. Let me ask one that we can answer.
This is Alan Turing, the computer scientist.
Alan Turing, yes. And he proposed the famous Turing test. And he said, now here's a good empirical question. And I think everybody ought to agree, look, if a computer can beat a human being in the Turing test.
Can you briefly explain what the Turing test is? Just
okay, I wonder if there's people here that don't know. Probably there are. You have a judge or two, let's just say one judge, keep it simple, and the judge is having a conversation with two different agents A and B. One of them is a human being, and one of them is a robot or a computer. And the identity is concealed, but the human a judge's job is to tell which is the human being and which is the robot. And if the robot or the computer doesn't have to have a body, if the computer program can fool a judge more often than not over a half-hour test, then we would all agree that is one intelligent computer program. Turing thought that this was a nice conversation stopper. It would end an interminable philosophical wrangle, which was not getting anywhere, and replace it with a question of some interest. Not one that he thought we should set about trying to answer empirically, but he just wanted to point out, how about replacing that old chestnut with this more easily answerable question? Now, I take it that that's the sort of thing that Lawrence was doing in his book. He was saying, yeah, there's a question about how you get something from nothing, or why is there a universe rather than nothing. We can bring changes on that ancient philosophical conundrum, but how about this? Here's a question which is at least very closely related to that, and we can answer it.
Yeah, well, look,
And
it's more than
once
that.
we answer it, who cares about the other question?
Right.
Well, yeah, but I'd say it's more than that. What science can do is sometimes say the other question is simply not a good question. For example, this is very important, because science can tell us that the kind of ways we're framing things are wrong. Like the why. I think most of us would agree the why question is not a good question.
And the Turing, but of course, what I want to add, just to drop the other shoe on this, is Turing. I thought it was a brilliant move, but it's failed miserably.
Yeah.
Because people they don't want to settle for that question. Now, maybe they should want to.
But they don't want to.
But they don't want to.
And people want to know the why question because they really want there to be some reason.
That's right.
And there may be no reason, and science has to recognize the fact there may be no reason. But better than saying the why question is not a good question, which it isn't, because it makes a presumption of an answer that there must be a reason, and there may be none. But a better one is it may say, for example, that our whole notions are wrong, which is where science, especially physics, but I imagine it's happening in other fields, changes the playing field so much. For example, it can say, well, the question is, so what happened before? Where did it come from? Is not a good question. May not be a good question, because if space and time are related in general relativity, when space is created, time is created, and the question before may not even have a meaning. Before may be something that arises when time arises, and time may not arise till after the Big Bang, so that whole concept, that whole human intuitive concept, goes out the window, and it's not the right way to ask the question.
But sometimes that is. Hold on a
you?
second, because sometimes that is definitely the case. I mean, what you described is exactly the process. Sometimes science shows that what we thought was a particularly a good question turns out actually to be either badly put or in fact completely meaningless.
Yeah.
Even. In other cases, I don't actually think that the Turing example is going quite in that direction. I mean, it's a good example in terms that, yes, Turing failed abysmally to convince everybody else, certainly philosophy departments, that he figured out the answer to the question, or that he had a better question, rather. But I don't think that the other question is in fact meaningless or uninteresting or whatever.
Which question?
The one that Turing did not want to answer. So there are interesting issues
well,
there.
Well, then we've got to disagree.
I know, we do. But there are interesting issues there about the nature of intelligence, the relationship between intelligence and consciousness, for instance, which are not at all the same thing. You can imagine a being, either biological or artificial, that is very intelligent but not necessarily conscious.
But that's the side issue. Let's get back to nothing.
No. But the reason I wanted to get there is because sometimes I see my colleagues in the sciences, and remember, I'm a scientist myself, so I'm talking to myself, which happens often, and I usually, when I argue with myself...
You have to be careful about it.
I know, it's a disease. But when I argue with myself, actually, I get it right. Because I convince the other self. Anyway, one of the problems with the science philosophy sort of antagonism is that I think it's unfortunate that it's seen by so many people, philosophers, some philosophers and some scientists as well, as an antagonism, because there are other ways to put what we just talked about. For instance, there is a model of progress, of philosophy making progress, that goes something along these lines. There are certain questions that philosophers are trying to clarify. Philosophy is mostly about clarifying things, about thinking about, what does that mean? What do we mean by this? Let's talk about this stuff. Then at some point, some of these questions become actually amenable to empirical answers, so they go into the scientific arena. We have several examples of entire disciplines, including science itself, of course, originating from philosophy. Now, what happens at that point? It's interesting. So we can mention several cases, so broad cases, like science itself came out of, what used to be natural philosophy. People like Descartes and even Newton actually thought themselves as philosophers, and then it becomes science.
But they also thought they were theologians too. So
I agreed. But natural philosophy, what used to be called natural philosophy, became science.
Sure.
What used to be part of branch of philosophy became eventually psychology independently. And to some extent, what is now philosophy of mind is turning into a combination of neuroscience, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, what happens at that point to philosophy? So are philosophy therefore out of business because, now the scientists are doing that? No. What happens in the history of philosophy is that now you switch, the philosophers switch their interest to observing that newly spun discipline from the outside. So now you have philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, philosophy of psychology, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that this is a progress, I think, because it's philosophers coming up with certain questions. The questions become empirically amenable to empirical answers. The scientists take them over. Now there is something else that is the problem, which is, how is it exactly the scientists are doing? What are they doing?
The value of philosophy is actually the next topic. So I just want to resolve this issue of nothingness.
On a fundamental disagreement.
Because I have a quote from your book, which I found interesting and provocative, or it's from an article maybe. So you... I assume that you agree with Professor Dennett that sometimes scientists can subtly change the issue and answer a more interesting question, right? Yeah. And then find out that the old question was maybe not worth asking.
That's wonderful.
But we have this issue of the nothing and the standard philosophical definition of nothing.
I don't know. No one's given me a standard definition.
Let's say that it is the absence of something.
Right? Well, that's easy.
Right. You have written that before the advancements of science, there have been, quote, abstract and useless debates about the nature of nothingness, and you say that to insist on this philosophical notion of nothing is backward and annoying. So we have a specific issue here. So there's this quantum mechanical notion of nothingness, which is not really nothing because it's steaming with energy and particles. And now we have those philosophers and also theologians insisting on, yes, but it's still something. You haven't explained...
Well, look, my point was just simple, and I suspect, again, we'll see. I suspect there'll be more agreement. Obviously one provokes, but the point is that you can't define nothing without knowing what something is. So as our scientific understanding evolves, the absence of something evolves, our understanding of that. So to require something without knowing very carefully what you mean by it, and what I mean by what you mean by it is what science has discovered about that. To do that in the absence of that is useless debate. And I think it more or less agrees with what Massimo said, that in some sense, philosophers try and understand the meaning of things by thinking about sometimes what the results of science does. And so to have a discussion about debate about what the absence of something is without talking about quantum mechanics or without talking about the vacuum or without talking about space and time and what they mean and all of that is maybe enjoyable, but it's not particularly informative.
There's many cases that I think bear that out. A traditional metaphysical issue is the nature of causation. Well, there's one way of studying causation, and that is look at the best science and see how science uses the idea, and look at work by sort of scientists, conceptual work on causation, people like Judea Pearl and so forth. And then you've really got a topic. Otherwise, what you're talking about is the folk notion of causation, and then you're doing anthropology.
Yeah.
Which, not that that's
it's just different.
bootless, but but it's naive if you think that it's getting at the truth as opposed to simply getting at what some human population thinks is an interesting way of defining causation.
And I think a lot of philosophy in that sense, not all philosophers, but for example, holding to an Aristotelian notion and requiring, and not also, I'm not
Nobody holds Aristotelian notions
but if you
anymore.
did that, if you did hold to an Aristotelian notion of something and saying, that is the thing I want to describe, you're having an interesting conversation about a concept, but that concept may not be related to reality.
But Lawrence, let me ask you a question. So, first of all, I actually disagree even in this particular case with Dan, I have to say, about the causality things. Yes, you're right that certainly the early discussions on causality, beginning with Hume, which is still the starting point, I think, in philosophy for any discussion on causality, they definitely do refer to what you call the full concept of causality. But I think that, I've actually read recently some of that literature in technical literature in philosophy of causality because I'm preparing to teach a seminar about this that includes that sort of stuff. And actually, the philosophers who are now working on that stuff very much do what I just described a minute ago, which is they do take on board the best notions that come out of science. Well, of course. Yeah. Well, they don't have to. It's not. I mean, you're making a moral statement. They have to.
Well, they have to if they want to be.
Right, and they are.
Honest.
So that the point is that they are. But I do get nervous when I hear scientists and some scientists, because I don't want to make the generalization too much, too broad. But when I hear sometimes, well, most of philosophy does X or Z or Y. I bet that most of those scientists have never actually read a technical paper in philosophy. So that's an empirical question. How can you make a generalization about what most philosophy does?
Actually, you hit the key point I was going to get to, which may sound judgmental, but it's not.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. And that is your picture, I would agree with, about how philosophy proceeds. And it then is a simple empirical fact, and I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a fact that the reason most scientists don't read philosophy is it doesn't have any impact on what they do. And that's fine. That doesn't mean it's bad. I don't want you to suggest it's bad. But the presumption that scientists would have to read philosophy of science is just not true. Scientists go about doing what they're doing, being ignorant about detailed questions that are not uninteresting from an intellectual perspective, but they're irrelevant to the science. So it is a true statement that once philosophy generally gets to the point where the science is producing the knowledge and the philosophers are discussing the meaning of that knowledge, it's interesting. Yeah. And you can read about it if you're interesting from an intellectual perspective, but it has no impact upon the science.
Well, but let me give you a different case, though, because I think that there's a better job for philosophers.
Okay.
And they're always looking for employment. So
surprise, surprise! It's what I've been trying to do.
They're not going to be put out of work.
You can't do science without doing philosophy. You can do it seat of the pants, informally, or you can do it reflectively. And some people are either brilliant or lucky, and they never consult any philosophers, and they don't make any howlers philosophically. And so they're in pretty good shape. And anybody like that, I think, is, in a certain sense, entitled to say, I'm just going to ignore philosophy. I don't seem to need it. But the fact is that in the areas which are particularly controversial, everything to do with the mind, all of neuroscience, in particular in the life sciences, maybe not physics, maybe
I think not physics, but I think I agree with where you're going.
But the fact is that they are the scientists, really smart people, and they know their fields, and very often they're asking questions that are just preposterous.
Exactly.
And what philosophers are really good at
is framing the questions.
Is coming up with better questions.
Yeah, and I think in the mind, anywhere where science, as it's really what you're saying, where science is at the edge, it doesn't really know yet how to define things. That's where philosophy generally has that impact. But after that point, it doesn't, and that's just empirical.
Here's my turn.
I have a nice quote from Professor Dennett's book that is relevant to this. To this discussion. Well, you already paraphrased the other quote that I had about there is no such thing as science-free philosophy. There is only science whose philosophical baggage is taken on board without examination. But the other quote that I wanted to bring up is from your latest book. I'm paraphrasing a little. a little bit. You say that you derive some sort of guilty pleasure from watching eminent scientists who have expressed what you call withering contempt for philosophy, and to watch those scientists stumble embarrassingly in their own philosophical efforts. Can you give us any names, Professor Dennett? Who are these scientists?
Oh, sure.
Humiliating us. Off the record, like
Off the record. Nobody's going to know.
Right.
No one here will talk about it.
There are eminent people working on consciousness, working on neuroscience, who frame the issues in just bizarrely unsuccessful ways. And they include some really heavy hitters. And I name them in the book, so I can name them here. I mean, Francis Crick had some really simple-minded ideas about consciousness.
He was the guy who discovered the double helix.
And how it worked.
You know, he's you could hardly pick a more eminent or more ingenious or more conceptually adroit scientist than Crick. And yet Crick had a real tin ear for some of these issues when he turned to neuroscience.
Yeah.
And he sought out the help of Christoph Koch, who's a wonderful neuroscientist, but he has not outlived his Catholic upbringing. And he's still sort of hankering for a soul. And I can point to the places in his work where you see, look what he's missing here, look what he's missing here, because he's still trying to sort of save a haven for the soul.
But he doesn't think
and I could multiply that by 20.
So, but he doesn't think that he needs to read philosophy. He just rashly enters into philosophical territory and thinks that he can just solve.
But Maarten, I think
But notice that Francis got better. He learned his lesson. He took on some philosophers, mainly Paddy Churchland and Paul Churchland, but also to some degree me. And he began to take us seriously because he realized these were hard questions. What really gives me guilty pleasure is seeing the
Even
books.
now.
There's been dozens of books about consciousness by eminent neuroscientists. Most of them are pretty dreadful. And they sink like a stone, and that's what they deserve. But very often, their authors even come, that close to acknowledging, if you look at the book carefully, that, they suddenly realize that they're in philosophical hot water, and they need help from a philosopher. And a few of them ask for help, and I really appreciate it. When they do that.
And I would say it hasn't happened in maybe 70 years in physics. But I absolutely agree in an area which is forming, where the questions need to be formed. But like philosophy of quantum mechanics, forgive me, but philosophy, I'll just say it, philosophy of quantum mechanics, there's a lot of philosophers of quantum mechanics who know something about quantum mechanics, but it doesn't, but the things we learn, but the progress in understanding quantum mechanics has not come. I mean, they're interesting, incredibly interesting philosophical questions about quantum mechanics, but the progress doesn't come from there.
All right,
How about
Maarten,
Andrew Shimoni?
But Shimoni's a physicist.
He's in the philosophy department.
Well, he's in the physics department. No, but Shimoni...
We can Google
Can
it.
I say? Yeah, you can Google it. I think it's my turn to say
question is what he's
something presumptuous, as Lawrence put it earlier. And this is it. I want to go back to what Lawrence said about philosophy of science and the role between philosophy of science and the relationship between philosophy of science and science, because I am, as I said, both a scientist and a philosopher of science. And I'm going to put forth, and this is the presumptuous part, that what you said a few minutes ago, was both conceptually incorrect and empirically wrong.
Okay.
And this is what I mean by that. So if you actually take a look at the philosophy of science literature, and by the way, there's no such a thing as the philosophy of science literature. There is a philosophy of quantum mechanics, there's a philosophy of other parts of physics, there's a philosophy of biology, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
So what you find are two things. There's at least two things, to simplify slightly. First of all, most of philosophy of science is not at all about helping scientists answer questions. So it is no surprise that it doesn't.
But
So
and
when
there's no
people,
reason it should.
when people like your colleague Stephen Hawking, to name names, starts out a book and says philosophy is dead because it hasn't contributed anything to science, he literally does not know what he's talking about.
Well, yeah, I
That
think
is
that's
not the point of philosophy, of science, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time.
But
So it's,
philosophers get offended when some scientist says, well, some philosophers do. It's just
Okay.
a fact. It's got other goals and aims and
Correct.
and techniques, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just
right,
okay.
but when there is nothing wrong with something, you don't say it's dead field. You just say
Well,
it's a different stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Well, theology, you say.
So
it's a dead
yes,
field,
you
but
can
okay.
say that. We
Yeah,
agree on
right.
that one.
Okay.
So that was the conceptual part of sort of that I objected to. That is, we need to realize that philosophy is largely in a different philosophy of science
Sure.
in particular, in a different kind of business.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't contribute to science, just like science doesn't contribute to English literature, or literary criticism, whatever you want to put it.
Science
But
fiction,
so
for
what?
example.
Nobody's blaming
Yeah.
the physicists
Yeah.
for not
Yeah.
coming up with
Yeah.
something new about Jane Austen,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
The other part is the empirical part. That is, when you say, they don't talk to each other, they don't have nothing to say to each other. I am not as familiar as Dan probably is with areas of philosophy of quantum mechanics, for instance. But I'm certainly very familiar with philosophy of biology. And there are plenty of scientists that actually do work with philosophers to clarify conceptual issues that come out of live problems in evolutionary biology. So there are subfields of philosophy of science where knowledge and even interaction with philosophy does in fact help science.
Absolutely,
Okay,
and it's those
great.
areas where
Great.
science is trying to form the questions.
Sure.
And intelligent discussion with people who've thought about those questions can never be a bad thing.
Right.
And so, I'm talking from a point of view of the area of science that I work on, and that's the area of physics. But absolutely, where science is at the edge of thinking about questions, then there's a very fruitful relationship. And I think consciousness is probably the prototypical
One of the best
example
examples, yes.
of where we're just flailing about, I think, still.
But let me get straight about one thing you're saying, Lawrence. You're saying that cosmology is an area of physics where
nothing useful is going to come from philosophy. Yes,
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
well,
I'm definitely saying
well,
because the questions.
does it
questions-
bother you that there are many physicists who think cosmology is just bad philosophy?
Well, I mean, look.
Which is the ultimate insult, of course.
Because there are.
It used to be. No, the great thing about cosmology is it's now a science. 30, 40 years ago it wasn't. That's why I also wrote this book. Because there's been a revolution in our understanding, our empirical understanding about the universe, so we can address questions that we could talk about before, but it was just talk. We can now actually ask questions that we might be able to get empirical answers about, and that is remarkable. But the fact that some scientists say something some scientists are Republicans. Again, it doesn't say anything bad about science. But
Or good about Republicans.
So what you're saying is that a lot of physicists haven't caught up with the progress in
no,
cosmology.
but the key question is, you can talk generalities, but the questions in cosmology, the fundamental questions, are ones that basically have a huge amount of intellectual baggage that's scientific, that the questions are going to only be resolved by understanding aspects of quantum gravity and measurements from the early universe. And so you can talk about them all you want, but the progress is going to be made in very technical areas of science, be it either theoretical physics or experimental science, and nothing, and there aren't conceptual questions that the basic conceptual questions, the ones people, they're very bland and general, and we've had them for millennia, and they're not new, and they're not going to add anything to that. They're really detailed questions that unfortunately it may require new language. I mean,
But now let me just name four physicists. Mm-hmm. Laughlin.
Yeah.
Penrose.
Uh-huh.
Smolin.
Uh-huh.
And you.
Yeah. I'm not sure I want to be in that list, but okay.
Too late.
All right.
Okay.
You're at the end. It's okay.
At least
Would you not agree?
Two of them are philosophers. Anyway, sorry, go on. Go on.
Ah.
And bad. One of them is bad.
Would you not agree that a lot of the reason that you don't like that company is because those are eminent physicists who are making, dare I say, philosophical claims that you don't trust.
No,
That you don't
they're
accept.
making claims. No, I would say they're making scientific claims that are beyond the domain of what science is now doing.
Well, that in itself, I think, is a philosophical claim.
Of course, yeah, it's fine if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's just dishonest. I mean, it's not. You can dress it up in all that language, but the question is, are you saying something that you're justified in saying on the basis of what we know about the world or not? And if you're not being honest, intellectually honest, and that is something I disagree with, whether you call it philosophy or physics.
Well, but those four people.
Well, I don't apply it to all of them. I'm not saying.
Not quite out of a hat, but the fact is, all four of you are very strongly opinionated. You're all brilliant, and you don't agree.
But no, we don't agree. But what we don't agree. The question is, what don't we agree about? We don't agree about questions that are not central to cosmology. I think that's a really important point. We all agree about what the data tells us about.
I think those people would disagree about the centrality of those questions. But I also would like to sort of caution, whenever we have these discussions, I think that we really should resist, unless we're talking about Republicans or theologians, the word intellectually dishonest, because that really imputes motives to people. I mean, I think there is
you're
very
right.
reasonable
And I didn't impute
disagreement.
that motive to all of those people.
Okay.
Maybe some subset. And
Okay.
But
and you're not going to tell us.
No,
that.
absolutely.
And in fact, actually, I should take that back also as far as Republicans and theologians are
Professor
concerned.
Krauss, would you agree that there is philosophy in your book? Because I have a quote here, and I think.
Look,
I don't want to accuse you of.
You could say anytime you think you're doing philosophy.
But
of course, philosophy is asking questions about the world, like science is, and so science was natural philosophy. But I mean, those are, as you just said, when you expand the definition off, it loses meaning. The question is, I try to talk specifically about the way we do science, what science has told us, what science hasn't told us, what's plausible, what's implausible, what's known, what's likely, what's unlikely. Those are scientific terms. And of course, they all impact on philosophical questions. The title of my book is, you could say, is a philosophical question.
Right.
But
can I give the example?
Don't you think
Can I give the example?
that we ought to initiate Lawrence into the band of philosophers who work in other departments?
Absolutely.
Well, no. Look.
Absolutely.
I have a doctor of philosophy, in fact.
Like anybody who has a PhD,
my
that's
PhD
right.
is a doctor of philosophy, so I'm a philosopher.
Right.
I view myself
There
as
is a
having the same.
there's a nice thought experiment in your book, and it
Thought
sounds
experiments, by the way,
almost
are physics
philosophical,
and
right?
okay.
But you probably know what I'm talking about, what I'm getting.
Well,
at.
he wrote
So
it,
in
so.
your book, there's
But Einstein's
some
thought
parts,
experiments
some
are physics,
philosophical
I should point
parts,
out. Right.
So you describe in your book a time in the distant future when all the evidence that we currently have for the Big Bang,
Will disappear.
so our basic picture of the cosmos, will disappear beyond what is called the observational horizon.
Yeah.
So very quickly, so all the traces that we now have of the origin of the universe will be erased. And so future scientists, maybe in a different galaxy, even when they are using the best available methods, will end up with a completely false picture of the universe just because they don't have the evidence.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating idea, of course, and it strikes me as quite philosophical. And it's also a sobering thought because it raises the question, is it possible that we find ourselves in a similar predicament, in a similar situation? Could it be that some part of reality will be forever hidden for us, just as it is for those scientists?
I raised it for that reason. I raised it to provoke that question and to provoke some humility in the sense that to realize that we have a picture that holds together, but we have all of science is based on a limited amount of data, and there's things we haven't measured, and there may be some things we'll never be able to measure, and therefore there could be some questions which are ultimately may ultimately, and I say may because it's not obvious, may ultimately be unanswerable. But it's a leap. What worries me, and I don't want to give people the wrong impression, the reason people in the far future will get the wrong answer is they don't have access to information. So I'm not saying that the Big Bang is going to ever be wrong. It's not. The Big Bang happened, just like evolution happened, because we have access to that data. Now, we don't have access to the data of right now, what happened at t = 0, and our picture of that could change dramatically. We don't have access to information about whether our universe is unique, and what's beyond the visible horizon. So that could change dramatically. So it's just the fact that we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing. And that's a presumption that a lot of people make. They say, oh, well, because science doesn't know this, I can't trust any of the basic science. And that's a real...
Yeah, that's baloney.
Yeah,
Professor
and
Dennett,
we all
would
agree
you-
on that.
would
But
you-
it's a common misunderstanding that people have about science.
Professor Dennett, would you say, as an expert on evolutionary theory and cognition, do you think that our brains, or the brains of future scientists for that matter, in different galaxies, are evolved or will have been evolved to grasp the fundamental structure of the universe? Maybe our minds are just not equipped for that.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it gets very close to what I consider the bad pseudo-biological argument for the limits of science.
Right.
And that's our brains are just finite brains, and just as the fish cannot understand democracy and the dog cannot understand quantum mechanics, so there must be all these realms that we cannot understand, because after all, we're just mammals with mammalian brains, blah, blah, blah. The reason that
Nice summary of
the reason that that's a pseudo, notice, by the way, it has some rather eminent exponents. Noam Chomsky, Jerry Fodor, and Colin McGinn,
right.
in order of eminence.
Increasing or decreasing?
You
Never
figure that
mind.
out. You can figure that out. So what's wrong with that argument? What's wrong with that argument, in fact, it's sort of comical when you think of Chomsky and Fodor, is that the dog, the fish, the monkey, they can't even understand the questions.
Yeah.
We got language. We can understand the questions. What makes you think that there are questions that we can understand, that the answers to which are not available at any cost, at any price? And then particularly what I think is important is that Chomsky, rightly, for decades, has been heralding and praising the near infinity of the human mind. Why? Because of the generativity of language. Now, if there are questions that are simply beyond our ken, that is, the questions we can understand, but the answers will stump us forever, like a question as simple as, what is consciousness? Or do we have free will? I think I understand those questions. The idea that we could not understand the answers, the true answers to those questions, has got to mean something quite bizarre. It's going to have to mean that there is no finite set of books in natural language which will gradually bring the reader of those books to an appreciation of the answer. Now, that might be true.
Right. Maybe
But
you could say
nothing in biology tells us that should be true.
It's making a presumption about something you don't know.
Yeah.
Saying we'll never understand something assumes you know all the things we can understand. And
maybe
that's
it's a sign of humility. You say, well, maybe there's a limit to the things that we are able to grasp.
Maybe,
Well,
but who knows? until
but
you
wait
try.
a minute.
You don't know, that's
You
right.
have to appreciate, I think, that it's not one brain at a time.
Right.
It's teams of brains and all of science. I'm sure, without the benefit of thousands of scientists and philosophers who've worked over the eons, I'd be unable to understand all sorts of really simple things. The fact is that I can benefit from all their hard-won understanding means that I can understand things. I like to point out that my grandchildren can easily understand concepts that my parents' generation were baffled by.
Yeah.
Right.
And now, of course, there may be limits, but it's not as if we're facing a stone wall somewhere. The idea that there's somewhere where there's this stone wall and we're just going to hit blank incomprehension when we get there, it's not biological, it's mystical. It's the idea that there is no trajectory through book land and science land that gets you there. But that has nothing to do with the limitations of
It
neurons.
also goes against the history of science.
Absolutely.
I mean, there haven't been any brick walls yet. That doesn't mean we won't come up yet. But there's no evidence for that so far. So why should you make the presumption that there will be?
Well,
Are you equally confident,
no,
Professor Pigliucci?
I'm not. I mean, I tend to agree with most of the gist of what Dan said. Certainly, I think that sort of the evolutionary argument for human limitations is false on the face of it. I mean, we didn't evolve to solve for Matt's last theorem, and we did. And there's no way you can argue that natural selection somehow favored that kind of abstract level of mathematical understanding. What the hell? Do mathematicians have a lot of children? I don't know, but certainly not in the Pleistocene.
Most of them can't meet women. So
Right, yeah, exactly. So it's like...
They multiply, right?
Right,
They
but
multiply all the
certainly
time,
not
right?
in the Pleistocene, right? I mean, so I agree with Dan that the evolutionary argument for sort of the intrinsic limitations of the human brain is baloney. I also don't think that the so-called Mysterian position, I mean, you mentioned Colin again, the so-called Mysterian position about certain issues like consciousness, I think there's reason to think that we'll never get there. It's utterly useless because it doesn't tell me anything actionable. Okay, It says, well, maybe there is a limit. Okay, well, if I get to the limit, I'll recognize the presumption, right? I'll
write you about
I'll hit the wall and then I'll figure it out.
Then I'll go play tennis. But
So
in the meantime,
exactly,
Yeah.
or chess. So, but for all of that, so that in that sense, I do agree. Now, I do think, however, that there are some interesting issues actually that certain areas of science are actually facing right now in terms of sort of human ability to understand things. For instance, there's been a debate in the last few years about massive data sets coming from molecular biology and now eventually from neuroscience. Neuroscience is not quite there yet.
Everywhere.
Yeah, but it's, molecular biology, certainly you've studied out, for instance, a few years ago, not so many years ago, with the Human Genome Project, proposing things like, we're going to have the human genome on a CD, and then you look at the CD and you figure out how to make a human being. Well, clearly that didn't happen. But not only that didn't happen, things got much worse. We got into genomics as an entire discipline. For a while, it was kind of comical in biology that every few days there was a new omics coming out. Yeah. So genomics, metabolomics, proteinomics, blah, blah, blah. And finally, phenomics, the entire phenotype. It's like, what the hell are these people talking about? Just because they rebrand something, they think that they're inventing something new. Anyway, the point is that we may have hit at least a temporary wall in some of those areas already, because it was really interesting to me to see, as a member of the Department of Biology, we had at some point at Stony Brook University a whole series of seminars about genomics. And these people were coming in, telling us all these very fascinating things about gene-gene interactions and networks and all that sort of stuff. And then I realized that the data analysis that they were doing, the techniques, the statistical techniques to analyzing that sort of stuff, were things along the lines of principal components analysis. Now, I don't know how many people here know what principal components analysis is.
I'm sure all of us.
All of you, right? But it's a complex, interesting, multivariate, statistical analysis to deal with complex data sets. In other parts of biology is what you do when you have no idea what you're doing. Because it's an exploratory analysis that sort of tells you, well, there is a cluster of data over here, there's another cluster of data over there. I don't know what the hell that means, but it's there.
It's exploring new territory.
It's exploring,
like
right. So what I'm
non-plus
saying is, the bottom line is, there may be areas where we actually are already hitting walls. They may be temporary walls.
But they're only walls because, but in a sense, you're validating what Dan said earlier. What you're really saying is there's some areas where you find you're asking the wrong questions. And you find you're asking the wrong questions by doing it, and you find it doesn't lead anywhere.
I'm not so
you move
sure.
somewhere else.
I'm not so sure. So that actually is a good example where there could be a difference. So, and I know a little bit about that more certainly than I know about quantum mechanics. So let me elaborate for a second. So, so the idea there is that the question is good. The question that we want to know there, the fundamental question is, how is it that gene-gene interactions and then interactions of genes with the environment during development create phenotypes? That is, the way things, organisms look, behave, and so on and so forth. That is a perfectly valid question, and we've been making progress in certain areas, with that question. But we seem to be hitting an area, a moment now, which, as I said, could be temporary, but a moment where the data is becoming so complex and so variable that we do not seem to have a way through the maze. We just see a bunch of complexity there. There's all sorts of interesting patterns, but we don't. Right. We're not able to extract the meaning.
It's already getting late. So I do want to have put up some questions that were asked by the audience.
Okay, but let me just say.
Sure.
I have
Let you go first, then I'll go.
Here's a downer of a hypothesis which comes out of the new data mining that people are doing. And that is, what if it turns out that we find that we can use data mining algorithms to get answers to all sorts of questions, which we are very sure that they're the right answers, but we can't understand how the process works at all. But we can go ahead and do science sort of flying blind, relying on our algorithms to give us the right answers. And if somebody says, but how does that work? And we say, well, it's...
And that's where we are.
That's, I think, a very real possibility. And at that point, we will have scientific prediction will go right on, and scientific fact-finding will go right on, but scientific understanding will sort of... It's not that it'll hit a wall so much as people will stop trying.
Well, no, I don't think. I think you guys are just experiencing the growth pains that physics has had, and the point is, it's happened a lot of times.
Isn't that always the case?
No, I know it sounds patronizing, but what really happens, it'll stagnate for a while. But someone will come. I mean, if the experience of science is that you'll have what we call phenomenological models, and an exactly similar thing happened in the 1960s. Accelerators were built. All these particles were discovered, and people just said, the more energy you have, the more particles you have, and they came up with these weird Zen-like things called bootstrap models. Every particle is made up of every other particle, and it's too complicated to ever really have a fundamental idea about, and we'll just try and look for patterns and see things, and for a long time, that's what was done. But eventually, someone had a good idea, and it moved forward, and it could be. It could be that it forever rates that way, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. It may be that a different way of thinking is required, and some young person here may come up with that way of thinking, and certainly that's what's happening in physics.
My intention was definitely not to show that, here we got it, we hit a wall. But I'm a little less optimistic, I suppose, that when you are, because the kinds of problems, the complexity that you're talking about in physics, that physics faced in the 1960s is literally billions of orders of magnitude less than what we're talking about here.
That's why
it may be or maybe not. I don't know.
No, you're absolutely right.
We'll find out.
That's why I'm into physics, because it's easy. These questions are much harder, and it's taking a lot longer to do it. But I think it's unlikely. I could be wrong. Of course, it's unlikely that they seem so daunting now that they don't seem solvable. But I wouldn't be surprised if in a few hundred years they're solvable.
Maybe not tonight, but in a few.
Maybe not tonight.
So, which reminds me that it's getting late. So I want to.
But people are having fun, right?
People are having fun.
They haven't left.
I
can't
can't
really see.
So what if we're all jet lagged here?
One of those fun-having people out there in the audience has submitted this question through text message. If politics
That's fancy.
were based more on proper science, how would it improve our society?
If politics were?
If politics were based on...
Yeah, well, I've written a lot about that. Public policy should be based on empirical evidence. And it's that simple. If you're going to try and make a policy, you should generally have some empirical basis for why that policy is reasonable. And if you don't, you should employ the policy and then check and see if it is. And that's a really simple thing. And if it were done more generally and used by most political parties, I think the world would be a better place.
But there is a downside to take very seriously, and that's this. What if the science in question is basically the science of spin doctoring, and
are you talking about economics?
And political parties who are already using technology in novel and interesting ways, and what if they really discover that they can craft messages which have almost no content, but that will win votes, and
as they have
the whole premise of democracy as an informed electorate is sort of out the window, because instead of informing the populace is being manipulated by images that are scientifically honed. This worries me a lot.
Well, I agree with you, and I want to make something clear that may not be obvious. I'm not saying that scientists have the answer to political questions. I'm saying that science should be the basis. So what we need to do is not that the politicians inform, it's the obligation of scientists to inform, not all scientists, but some scientists to inform the public of what we know and what we don't know and how we learn and how we ask questions so that they can make informed decisions about what they're hearing from the politicians. But even having said that, I'm not saying that scientific results should be the basis of public policy. For example, there are political questions. So what you need to know is that global warming is happening. And you need to know that humans are impacting on climate. But you could easily say, okay, I accept that scientific fact, but as a political decision, I need to burn coal. Right. And that's a political decision, and you have to, but to make the correct decision, you have to know, and the public needs to know, what the implications are. But that doesn't mean that the scientific answer, which is burning coal is bad for the environment, is always going to be the correct political answer. Right. That's not the case. People have a right to make the vote based on an informed decision that, you know what, I don't give a damn, I want to burn coal. Because, that's just the way democracies work. So right. I think, but we need to inform people so they don't buy the crap from politicians, that they learn the scientific process of how to be skeptical, how to ask questions.
And in fact, I think that's a point I want to underline. All the methods, all the propaganda methods are counteractable, actually quite straightforwardly, by simply informing people about those very methods.
Exactly.
And getting them tuned in to the fact that an attempt is being made to manipulate them.
Everybody signed up for a critical thinking course.
Right.
Well, that's what science should be, right?
Well,
or philosophy.
Or philosophy, right.
Any good academic field should be based.
That is true. That is correct. Now, but I wanted to give a slightly different answer. I think that to the question that was posed, which is, again, it's a question of nuance. I thought it was interesting that Lauren's immediate answer was policy ought to be informed by. Your first action was not politics, but policy. There's a difference between politics and policy. Yeah. Absolutely, policy ought to be informed by the best empirical evidence that we have, because otherwise you literally are blundering into nonsense, into bad notions. So yes, if there is such a thing as global climate change, anthropogenic climate change, and there is, then that has to be part of any policy decision. Yeah. Now, the other part, however, this is sort of analogous to the discussion we were having early on about the empirical input into ethical decision-making, into ethics. There definitely has to be empirical input into political decision, but part of political decision-making also is concerned with people's ways of looking at the world, their value, their judgments about what's important, what's less important, right? So, for instance, you could say, if in fact you want to, solve the problem of poverty, let's say in the United States, then you need to enact certain, redistribution of wealth measures and so on and so forth. And that is a fact. But it flies politically only if we actually convince people that ought to be a priority. If people say, well, no, personal liberty or freedom of acting as an independent agency is more important than, in other words, my value is high, that value is higher to me than the other one, then there's nothing you can do factually to convince those people. You have to argue about, well, what do you mean by that? Have you thought about the implications from an ethical perspective? What that means is that in order to allow for some people to be obscenely rich, you are actually condemning a bunch more people to poverty. That sort of argument is clearly informed by the facts, but it doesn't stop at the fact. Again, the facts sort of, in some sense, underdetermine the answer. The answer has to imply value judgments, and therefore, I would say, ethics.
Right. But the job, I agree with you, and in some sense, the job of the politicians, if there is one, is to then say, here are my value judgments. Yeah. Do you agree with them? Correct. Elect me if you do.
Correct.
But not, here's the facts.
Yes.
Here are my facts. I've invented them.
You can argue values. You cannot argue facts.
You say honestly you say. Look, I don't want to solve the problem of poverty. I want to ensure some people can be obscenely wealthy and whatever. And it just put it out there, and there'll be people who agree. And if democracy has any value, if you believe in it, then you say, well, if more people like that value, then that's the way we got to live with.
Exactly.
We're all entitled to our opinions, but not entitled to our facts.
Our own facts.
Right.
Well, yeah, of course.
Right.
Actually,
here's another question.
I'm not even entitled to our own opinions?
No.
I agree.
Not all opinions are created equal.
There was a lovely paper by a philosopher whose name escapes me, a young philosopher from Australia, who challenged that idea that we're entitled to our opinions. I thought, he's right. We all pay lip service to that. And in fact, in what sense are you, if your opinions are ill-informed
Or incoherent.
and incoherent, in what sense are you entitled to
Well,
them?
I think Ricky, in the movie that we produced, Ricky Gervais in it, he says, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but I'm entitled to find their opinion ridiculous. And I think what the point is that,
sure.
yeah, they can express it, but we should be able to ridicule it as being
yeah.
ridiculous. And that's why we should be allowed to ridicule religion like we do sex and politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait,
Right.
what's ridiculous about sex? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So all of you are entitled to your opinion about the following question, which goes as follows. Let me see.
But only
it's
because
in
we're
Dutch, so
informed.
Yeah.
yeah, right.
Only because we're here.
Economics makes claims about what is beneficial, what is good for humanity. Is that a form of science, or is that that eventually lead to a form of religion? So it's basically a question about the status.
Ideology.
Well,
of
we're not
economics.
economists, but I'm very skeptical that economics. I mean, economics is an attempt to make decisions about very complex systems, and obviously, they're so complex that those conclusions are not necessarily reproducible. If you look at the history of economics.
Right.
I think that economics is fascinating because if you think of it broadly, and we're back to a sort of semantic issue, there's lots of issues which actually are well addressed using the tools of economists that have nothing to do with money or standard economic topics at all. They have to do with organization and influence and all sorts of other things. I think that, in fact, let's have more of that. But what's also true is that economists being under the gun to provide hard data and predictions that can be quantified have this lamentable practice of operationalizing everything in terms of money. And then, as I think even very unreflective people recognize, there's something really missing when economists reduce everything to monetary values. It's not that there's some magic ingredient missing. It's just that putting monetary values on everything has a price, is just a very blunt tool.
But so is putting an equation on everything when you don't really know, when the equations aren't justified. I mean, the
Absolutely.
Nobel Prize in Economics, the Nobel Memorial Prize, it's not a Nobel Prize, in economics this year, I was so amused for it because, of course, two people that won the prize have two completely different ideas about what the results of the same phenomena are, which to me represents economics.
So again, I like to make some distinctions again. So first of all, as you know, there's fundamental differences between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Certain areas of economic theory actually work pretty well. They produce reliable predictions in terms of empirical verification and so on, and other parts don't. Also, within some, there are different approaches to doing economics, right? There's sort of a classical economist who might start with the assumption of a perfect rational agent who has perfect access to information, that sort of stuff, and new models that are mathematical models that are perfectly fine as far as models go. They don't match up with reality very well because guess what? We don't have perfect information and we're not perfect rational agents. There is another way of doing that sort of economics, which is behavior economics, and that imports sort of psychology and sociology into it, and it's much more, I think, interesting and probably more likely to.
That's why Daniel Kahneman is so fascinating.
Correct. Now the other thing about economics is, again, we go back to ethics. The economists seem to have this idea that what they do is ethically neutral, and it's not. Because a lot of stuff, the very fact that Dan pointed out that everything is measured in one particular currency, that's just one example. But a lot of assumptions that go in certain economic models actually sneak in a lot of, Dan will say philosophical baggage, I would say ethical baggage in particular. And so it's simply not the case that economics is ethically neutral. There are these assumptions. These assumptions ought to be put out into the open and say, well, look, if you approach economic problems from this perspective, let's say a libertarian perspective as opposed to a progressive perspective, whatever it is, this is what you're sneaking in. You're bringing into the reasoning. The reasoning may be valid. It may be good reasoning, but you now have to expose these assumptions, and then you have to let people say, well, I actually don't think these assumptions are the ones that I want to have when I'm thinking about running an economy. And so you may be formally correct in terms of your models, but the assumption you start with embed some kind of ethics that I don't like.
And to follow up about the last part of your question, it really is unfair to economics, though, to say it ends up as being religion, because you can see if it's wrong,
Right.
and that's the big difference.
Right. Maybe a final question.
Already?
Probably directed to Professor Dennett. Is consciousness a scientific fact? Does it exist? Can we measure it, etc.? Because there has been a rumor, and I'm adding this now, that you would deny the existence of consciousness, that you are a so-called eliminativist. So you don't think that it exists. Is this rumor true?
And you got 2 minutes to answer.
Right.
The trouble with the word consciousness, with the concept of consciousness, is that not only is there no agreed upon definition, people don't want to agree on a definition. Because a lot of people want consciousness to turn out to be whatever it is that is just so supercalifragilisticexpialidocious that it defies science. And anybody who puts forward a theory of consciousness which says, oh, and by the way, it's a biological phenomenon, it's very wonderful, but then so is reproduction, so is self-repair, so is blood clotting, so is metabolism. For a lot of people, if you take that view on consciousness, I often put it, it turns out that consciousness is not one big trick, it's a bag of tricks. And it's not something that sunders the universe into the things that have it and the things that don't. And the question, gee, I wonder if starfish are conscious, or maybe mice, or maybe how about ants or cockroaches? And they think there's this magic dividing line somewhere, between the oak tree and the human being where, bingo, the consciousness starts. I think that very idea, which is deeply ingrained in the thinking of many people who, as I say, think that consciousness divides the universe in two. You either got it or you don't.
Right. The idea that suddenly the light goes on.
And that idea is an artifact of bad imagining right there. And we have to get rid of that idea, and we have to get people to recognize, as long as you insist on that as a sort of a defining characteristic of consciousness, then you get your wish, we'll never have a theory of consciousness. But abandon that idea and start looking at what different kinds of consciousness, or so-called consciousness, or hemi-semi-demi consciousness. As soon as you start getting out of that essentialist mode and looking for the dividing line, then consciousness is a very real family of phenomena, not a single phenomenon, a family of phenomena.
All right.
I agree,
do you have
but
any short final statements about consciousness, or maybe in general?
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing. If I hear correctly, Dan, I agree with what he said, but I might be about to just step into a really, really bad situation. So
it's about to end, so you have to.
Yeah. So as I look at it as a biologist,
okay,
not
I'm
as
ready.
a philosopher. Yeah, exactly. I look at it as a biologist, not as a philosopher of mind, because I'm not a philosopher of mind. And so I agree completely that there is this fallacy of, there is a dividing line, this essentialism idea that it's bizarre to me. If consciousness is a biological phenomenon, and I think we agree that it is a biological phenomenon, unless we're talking about something completely different, then it ought to come, gradually, or, that doesn't mean exactly gradually. There may be, jumps here and there, but it must be in degrees, and therefore it makes no sense to say, well, here's the dividing line, these things have it, these things don't have it. Of course, there is another dividing line. I mean, there is an entire universe that is inanimate as far as we can tell. And that one I'm going to bet pretty strongly that doesn't have consciousness. Rocks don't have consciousness. But if we're talking about a biological world, clearly it's a question of degrees and not a question of yes or no. That said, I really never understood. I mean, I agree again with Dan before stepping into the problem here, the self-inflicted problem. I also agree with Dan that, yes, there is plenty of people who seem to sort of equivocate almost on purpose on the term, to make it more fuzzy, more Mysterian, more whatever it is. But I honestly, every time that I read a paper about definitions of consciousness, I don't get why the thing is so damn complicated. I don't mean the answer to how it works. That is complicated. But the thing itself. I mean, to me, consciousness is the ability that is shared pretty much as far as we know by at least all animals of experiencing, having phenomenal experiences. That is, having things, experiencing things like heat, cold, color, that sort of stuff. This is the ability.
That's something that robots do if they have heat sensors, right?
I'm fine.
Yeah,
of course.
depends what you mean
well,
by
maybe.
It
maybe.
depends what you mean by experiencing, of course.
Yeah,
What do you
right.
mean?
Well,
Do you mean,
yes,
a
of
dial
course
goes
it
up,
does.
or something?
Of course it does. But what I'm saying is, this is, so if you look at your own ability of doing the kinds of things we're doing right now, this is, that's consciousness. Now, in the case of human beings, and possibly of other organisms, you have a significantly more interesting additional level, which is the ability to reflect on those experiences, right? Of having these consciousness that you really are having those kind of experiences. Now, there's nothing mysterious about it. It seems to me that goes down to biology. It's going to be we don't have the answer, but it's going to be some combination of, certain materials interact in certain ways, and they create that sort of capacity, just like materials interacting in certain ways create all sorts of other biological capacities.
The one trouble with that definition, simple as it is that it flies in the face of many people's intuitions, and maybe just are happy with this, because it turns out that on that definition, athlete's foot is conscious.
Yeah, it's like the definition of life. It's very hard. Many people would say life is something that organizes, takes energy, but then fire is life. And so, as a physicist, I would say the good thing is that it's far too complicated an issue for me, and I plan to continue to drink this tonight until I lose consciousness. Right. And so
Professor Dennett once wrote, I think, that nothing that is complicated enough to be interesting could have an essence or something along those lines. Maybe that's a good way to bring things to a close.
That's the essential message of this debate.
So I want to thank all of you. You have been a great audience. It has been terribly exciting. Unfortunately, we have to stop at some point. We could go on and on forever, of course. I want to thank all our volunteers of Het Denkgelag for their tremendous support and help in making this possible. I want to thank the Ghent University for hosting this event, all the people that have been handling the technical equipment. And of course, the three of you, Professor Massimo Pigliucci, Dennett, Lawrence Krauss.
Right.
Thank you. Thanks.